Hey there, brave souls. Tonight, we unlock the iron gates of a civilization often praised for its glory and expose the shadows it worked so hard to hide. We're heading deep into the marble corridors of ancient Rome, into a world of sharpened laws, silent altars, and bodies treated as property. Picture this: golden statues gleaming in the afternoon sun, and just behind them, a girl entombed for the sake of honor. A wife cast aside for not producing a son. A servant marched through the forum, not as a person, but as spectacle. This wasn't just cruelty, it was calculated. This was Rome, not just the cradle of law, but the tomb of womanhood. And believe me, what you're about to hear will forever shift your view of the so-called glory of the empire. So before we open the blood-stained scrolls of history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if the truth doesn't make you turn away. And in the comments, tell us, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Because history's shadows never sleep, and they're always listening. You see her standing beneath the marble arch, cloaked in white linen, hair perfumed with crushed roses and olive oil. Her eyes are wide, but not with joy. Rome calls this a wedding. She knows better. This is not a union. This is an arrangement. In ancient Rome, marriage wasn't sacred, it was strategic. Behind the beauty of colonnades and carved gods, a darker current pulsed beneath the surface. A woman did not marry for love, nor for will. She was given, passed from father to husband like a vineyard deed. The ceremony had a name, confariatio, but it could have just as easily been a ritual of relinquishment. Under Roman law, manus ruled all. Manus, Latin for hand, but here it meant control. Once married, the husband held manus over her. She was no longer under her father's guardianship. She was under his, legally, spiritually, entirely. And this was not symbolic. It was legal erasure. She could not own property. She could not leave on her own terms. She could not speak in court without permission. If she brought a dowry, it became his. If she once held land, it slipped quietly from her name. If she once had freedom, it waited behind with her childhood. At the edge of her new home, the Roman household was known as the domus. And at its center stood the paterfamilias, the ruling male, first the father, then the husband. He held unquestioned authority over everyone beneath his roof. That included servants, children, and wives. You walk down a corridor built of pale stone. One wall bears paintings of smiling gods in the sky. The other side, a room cloaked in silence, where a young woman endures childbirth alone. No physician has been summoned. Her husband chooses to wait. He hopes for a son. And the child she carries may not fit his hope. In Rome, a woman's body was viewed through the lens of duty. She was expected to bear children, for family, for legacy, for the future of the state. In fact, Roman law encouraged motherhood not for nurture, but for numbers. The Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus, issued by Emperor Augustus around 18 BCE, rewarded women who bore 3 or more children. Not out of care, but because the empire needed new citizens, new heirs, new fighters. But motherhood in Rome came with no protection. Childbirth was risky, filled with unknowns. There were no antiseptics, no anesthesia. Midwives varied in skill, and complications were frequent. If a woman passed during delivery, it was seen as a noble offering, made for the family, for the empire. In difficult births, Roman physicians turned to tools that would appear horrifying today. Bronze hooks, curved instruments, meant to assist in removing the child if nature refused to cooperate. They called the procedure embryotomy. For the mother, there was no comfort, no relief, only whispered prayers and silence behind closed doors. Now you step into a quiet archive room buried within a Roman villa. Dust hangs in the air, Scrolls line the walls, records of lives long forgotten, transactions, births, lineages. One faded parchment reads, Flavia, given in marriage to Marcus Lucius Severus. Dowry, 30,000 sesterces, 4 mules, and 1 household servant. Her name appears only once, the livestock, twice. In Roman society, dowries were currency. A bride's family offered wealth to the groom's household: land, silver, animals. The larger the dowry, the greater her appeal. But if the marriage ended, whether by fate or fracture, retrieving that dowry often meant a legal contest. And in that courtroom, her words carried little weight. Even more unsettling, some girls were promised in marriage at a startlingly young age. By Roman law, 12 was considered acceptable for a legal union, as long as certain limits were observed, but enforcement was weak, and expectations did not always wait. Picture a lavish dinner in a marble atrium. Laughter drifts over golden goblets and silver trays filled with figs and roasted meats. At the head of the table, a husband leans toward his young bride. She is 16, her appetite quiet. Across from them, a guest raises his wine and offers a crude toast. The others laugh. She lowers her gaze. Her opinion was never asked. In Rome, what happened behind closed doors was seen not as affection, but as obligation. A wife was expected to secure the family line. If she objected, she could be corrected, not through the courts, but through customs and laws that favored the head of the house. There was no word in Latin for personal boundaries within marriage as we define them today. Writings from jurists like Gaius and Ulpian speak often of ownership, of duty, of obedience. Rarely, if ever, do they speak of care. If a woman resisted, the law offered no shelter. If she ran, she could be retrieved. If she raised her voice, she risked being silenced, through law, through shame, or through force. There are even stories where fathers were praised for punishing daughters accused of disloyalty. Not condemned, but celebrated, cleansed by the law, clothed in the robes of virtue. You now stand before a funeral pyre. A woman lies beneath linen shrouds, her face calm as candlelight. But the truth of her life lies buried with her. She passed at 23. Some say it was during childbirth. Others whisper of a quiet end. Her name was Livia. She was married at 13. In 10 short years, she gave life to 5 children, mourned 2, and never once spoke within the courts of law. Rome remembers her kindly. She is called a good wife. The ideal Roman woman was expected to be composed, fruitful, and yielding. Even the statues of goddesses, Juno, Venus, were carved with lowered eyes and still expressions, perfect posture, silent strength. But behind that marble gaze was a world that turned breathing women into figures of silence. There were some who defied this fate, women like Hortensia, who stood boldly in the Roman Forum to challenge attacks placed upon women of wealth. She raised her voice where others dared not, but she was the exception. Her bravery was noted, yet the system remained unchanged. For most, speaking out came at a heavy price. Even women of power like Julia, daughter of Emperor Augustus, found no safety. Accused of straying from accepted norms, she was cast out. Her titles revoked, her possessions seized. Her mistake, as the whispers went, was living too freely. In Rome, a woman's independence was rarely celebrated. More often, it was erased. You walk the ruins now. Broken columns, faded mosaics, the echoes of sandals on stone. Tourists marvel at the architecture, the history, the empire that once ruled the world. But beneath your feet are the ghosts of thousands of women. Their voices were not carved into marble. Their stories were not written in scrolls. But they were real. Their lives were measured in dowries. Their bodies were bound by law. Their choices were erased before they could be made. And in the eyes of Rome, that was order. That was civilization. But the truth lingers, like the scent of ashes long after the fire is gone. Rome's greatness came at a cost, and it was often women who paid the price. You see her in the flicker of a torchlight, barely 10 years old, standing in a circle of priests. Her hands are trembling, clutching a wreath of laurel leaves. Around her, the temple of Vesta looms. She stands in solemn silence. White-robed figures chant ancient hymns to a goddess no eye has ever seen. She is about to take her vows as a Vestal virgin. The city calls her chosen, but in her heart, she feels the weight of something she cannot name. At the center of Rome burned a sacred fire, eternal, unwavering. This was the flame of Vesta, guardian of hearth and home, and it was watched over by the most revered women in the empire, the Vestals. To the public, they were honored. Their place near emperors marked them as sacred. Their words were trusted, their presence believed to bless the empire. But inside the temple, behind the stone walls and endless ceremonies, the world was different. Beneath the marble, beneath the rites, there was quiet, a silence that was not peace, but duty. You walk across the ancient stone courtyard. Pigeons scatter into the air. Dust clings to your sandals with every step. Inside the circular temple, you find 6 beds arranged in perfect order, each one draped in white linen. No laughter, no warmth, only stillness. This was not a place of comfort. It was a chamber of devotion. The Vestals were selected while still children, between the ages of 6 and 10. For their families, it was a rare honor. It brought recognition, support from the state, and social prestige. But for the girls, it meant 30 years of sacred duty, bound by customs few could grasp at such a young age. 10 years of learning, 10 years of guarding the flame, 10 years of passing the knowledge on. During this long service, they could not marry, could not raise families, and could not express personal longing. They lived apart, separated from many of the joys and sorrows shared by others. They could not dine with men, could not show outward mourning, could not choose their own path. Their world became fire, keeping it alive day and night. And should that flame ever falter, it was said to be a troubling sign for all of Rome. You hear the whispers. One flame wavers low, dancing in the wind. A shadow crosses the sacred altar. A priest's voice sharpens. Who let it die? A young girl is called forward. Her eyes widen. Her lips do not move. She already knows what this means. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, described how deeply Rome valued the duties of the Vestals. If the sacred flame ever went out, it was seen not as chance, but as a sign of something far worse, and the one tasked with its care would face immediate consequences: public scorn, ritual correction, a loss of honor before she was even grown. But even that was considered light compared to what awaited those accused of breaking the highest vow of all: purity. If a Vestal was thought to have violated her sacred commitment, even without evidence, there was no reversal. Her role ended permanently. Rome, ever mindful of its image, could not bring itself to carry out direct punishment on sacred ground. So instead, they created a ceremony. You descend into a quiet corridor beneath the temple. The air grows colder. The light fades. A sealed door stands ahead, carved from stone. It will never open again. Beyond it lies a chamber prepared for silence. A bed, a single lamp, a jar of water, a loaf of bread. Not enough to sustain life, just enough to suggest it had not been taken. She was led through the Forum in solemn procession, clothed in white, her head gently bowed. Crowds gathered along the path. Some looked on with sorrow. Others nodded in approval, believing it was a sacred duty, a ritual for the gods. She descended into the prepared chamber. The stone above her was sealed. Stillness returned. The ritual was complete. Her name soon faded from records. Her story left untold, she became a symbol, a lesson for those who followed. Now imagine the quiet, not peaceful but buzzing, the kind of silence that lingers after a cry. Above, the sacred flame still flickers. Rome marches on, its voice loud and proud. But beneath the stone, another light has quietly vanished. History remembers a few who met this fate. Cornelia, most notably, condemned in 90 BCE. She maintained her innocence until the very end. Some said her case was political. Others whispered of matters of the heart. But Rome, in moments of crisis, rarely waited for proof. Seneca the Younger would later reflect on the risks of blending religion with power. Vestals, though revered, could become scapegoats, blamed for unrest, disaster, or divine displeasure. In troubled times, someone had to answer, and a silent figure in white was an easy choice? Now picture the paradox. A woman barred from voicing her dreams, yet made to carry the sacred soul of an empire. Her quiet obedience was honored, but the moment she lived for herself, her story ended. The Vestal system was meant to uplift. These women held rare legal status. They could own property, live without male guardians. They were respected, so long as they followed every rule. But even their freedom came with conditions. They were observed closely, their actions noted. Their presence became a reflection of the state's ideals. And if they ever stumbled, no matter the reason, the temple did not shield them. You stand now at the ruins of the Atrium Vestae. The marble lies fractured, the columns are weathered, but the hearth remains, darkened by centuries of sacred flame. Nearby, a plaque reads, "Sacred Keepers of the Eternal Fire." No names appear, only stillness. What becomes of a society that demands perfection from its women, yet leaves them exposed? What happens when a child is chosen before she even understands her own path and told her life must belong to ritual? In ancient Rome, holiness could mean distance, and the pursuit of purity often came at a quiet cost. Somewhere, a candle flickers. In a modern museum, behind layers of glass, rests the broken statue of a Vestal. Her face is calm, her hands folded in devotion, but her eyes, etched in white marble, seem to stare beyond time itself, as if still waiting for someone to remember. Rome's eternal fire is long extinguished. The empire is gone. The temples are dust, but the echoes remain. In every system that favors image over individual, in every voice that is honored only when it stays silent. You see her standing at the edge of a crowded Roman street. Her robe clings to her shoulders. Her face is composed, but her hands tremble ever so slightly. On her ankle, a small mark, inked into her skin, tells the city who she is, not her name, not her family, just a role. One word, meretrix. In ancient Rome, morality wasn't hidden. It was public, spoken aloud, carved into records, worn like a sign, and no label shaped a life more completely than infamia. Infamia wasn't just gossip, it was legal, a status sealed in ink and law. Once assigned, it changed everything. You could no longer marry freely, inherit, or speak in court. You weren't seen as a full citizen. You were reduced to a title, often for life. And the most haunting part? You didn't have to commit a crime to receive it. A whisper could be enough, and once marked, it rarely came undone. You now step through a quiet alley behind the Forum. Two young girls stand near a wooden post, eyes wide, following the shifting crowd. Their gazes search for kindness, but none arrives. It is Saturnalia, a Roman festival known for music, reversal of roles, and unrestrained celebration. During these days, the streets filled with songs, torches, and feasts. Lords waited on servants. Laws relaxed, but only for some. For enslaved women and girls, Saturnalia could be something else entirely. They were often dressed in garlands and presented to guests. not with dignity, but with expectation. Their presence was framed as part of the celebration. These were not choices. These were customs written into tradition, justified by stories that claimed their emotions were somehow different. Wealthy Romans boasted of their domus, their homes filled with luxury, but not just the marble and mosaics. The people within, especially the youngest, were seen not as individuals, but as living emblems of wealth and rank. In a villa high above the Tiber River, a nobleman lifts his goblet and toasts his guests. "She sings like a goddess," he declares, gesturing toward a young performer standing nearby. "She appears no older than 16. But more importantly," he adds with a grin, "she understands grace." Laughter follows. The girl says nothing. She's learned that silence often brings safety. In Roman society, performers, actors, dancers, musicians carried a social mark not for any crime, but simply for being seen. To appear in public, to use one's voice or movement to entertain, was often enough to be labeled. Why? Because in the Roman world, presenting oneself on stage was seen as crossing a line. Even if your art was dignified, even if you lived within the law, your presence was sometimes all it took. The assumption of impropriety was built into the system. They had a name for it, notio infamiae, a presumption of shame. And once it was recorded, it followed you for life. A woman with this label could not reclaim full social standing, not through marriage, not through service to the state. Her voice had lifted others, yet its very presence made her visible. And in ancient Rome, visibility could come with a cost. Now imagine a city where dignity isn't something earned, it's something that can be taken away. Where a father might register his daughter as a courtesan out of jealousy. Where a husband, in a moment of anger, could assign shame through a signature. No hearing, no judgment, just ink and decree. In ancient Rome, the law permitted a troubling reality. A man, father or husband, could officially declare a woman a meretrix or courtesan without presenting any evidence. Suspicion was sufficient. Social pressure could become a sentence. Once registered, the consequences were immediate. Her legal status changed, even if she had never exchanged coin, never walked near the marked quarters. The label was permanent. It could not be appealed. It was a decision not carved in stone, but recorded in law and nearly impossible to reverse. You walk past the edge of Subura, Rome's notorious lower quarter. Wall mosaics advertise services. Red lanterns sway above narrow doorways. Inside, rooms are small, stone beds with thin cloth covers. In one quiet corner, a girl sits alone, arms wrapped tightly around herself. The air carries the scent of smoke and worn coins. In Rome, prostitution was legal, but only under strict regulation. Brothels, known as lupanaria, operated openly and were taxed by the state. Workers were required to carry identification. Some were assigned distinct hairstyles or clothing to set them apart from others. And yet, legal recognition did not mean protection. Those in the profession were often left vulnerable. Their status kept them outside the safety of the very laws that claimed to recognize them. A woman who worked within a brothel, whether by choice or through circumstance, was given the label infamies. This status changed everything. She could not turn clients away. She could not appeal for protection if harmed. Her name, her rights, her voice, removed from the system that still counted her among its prophets. You turn a corner and step into the bustling marketplace. There, on a raised platform, stand 6 young girls. Some laugh nervously. One wipes her cheek with the edge of her sleeve. A man in polished robes approaches, examining them with studied eyes. "This one," he says, motioning to a girl barely into her teens. "Does she sing?" In Rome, the treatment of children, especially those born into servitude, was shaped by policy, not compassion. Their roles were often decided from birth. Some were taught music, movement, and manners from a young age. By the time they reached adolescence, they were assigned to households or venues to perform, entertain, and serve. They were not encouraged to choose. They were taught to comply, to smile on cue, to vanish behind painted eyes and shining jewelry. Elsewhere in the grand chambers of the Senate, voices rise over matters of empire and coin. Not far away, a woman named Gaia is led through the city streets. Her robe hangs uneven. Her hair has been cut short. Around her neck, a wooden placard bears a word, unfaithful. Onlookers whisper, some jeer. No one pauses to ask her truth. In Rome, public humiliation wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Women accused of impropriety were sometimes subjected to displays of shame, disheveled garments, visible signs, and mocked accusations written for the crowd. These scenes weren't simply punishment, they were performance. And Rome was a city that admired performance above all else. Punishment in Rome didn't always mean finality. Sometimes the sentence was to live, marked, remembered, avoided, to become a cautionary figure, a presence seen but never acknowledged, alive yet slowly erased. Tonight, the public baths are filled. Voices bounce across the marble walls. Steam swirls through the air, blurring faces and muting whispers. In one quiet corner, a woman sits apart. A small symbol on her shoulder is now uncovered. She was once married, once wealthy, but a single accusation shifted everything. Rome prided itself on its structure, its morals, its laws, but those laws bent around the powerful, and grace was often reserved for men. For women labeled infamies, reinvention was nearly impossible. No fresh start, no restored name. Even in death, many were laid to rest without ceremony, their names missing from family tombs, their stories ending mid-sentence. Now you stand at the edge of the Roman Forum. Above you, statues of men, senators, generals, emperors. Below, worn stones polished by centuries of forgotten footsteps. Beneath them lie lives that history chose not to honor. Rome called itself civilized. It celebrated its roads, its aqueducts, its codes of law. But for women, for those in servitude, for those who spoke, sang, danced, or simply stood in the wrong light, it was a city of performances, where shame could be assigned without cause, and joy, if it ever came, was rarely their own. You see her lying in a dark chamber, the scent of herbs heavy in the air. Her hands rest at her sides, still. An older woman leans over her, gently waving a bundle of smoking leaves above her stomach. The girl says nothing. She's been told this will help, that it will wake the womb. But all she feels is warmth and the quiet weight of worry. The fear that something inside her is not as it should be. In ancient Rome, a woman's value was too often measured not by her thoughts or words, but by her ability to bear children, to bring forth sons, to continue the family line. And if she could not, the world around her grew distant. Infertility was rarely treated as a mystery of nature. It was seen as a shortcoming. And more often than not, the burden of that blame was placed on her. You walk through a physician's atrium. Scrolls line the shelves, diagrams of the female body, sketched by hands that never asked permission. On a nearby table, tools glint under torchlight, bronze instruments once thought to cure. The air carries the sharp scent of iron and vinegar. This is not comfort. It is control, wrapped in ritual. In ancient Rome, medicine for women was a strange mixture of theory, trial, and tradition. When a woman could not conceive, the treatments offered were often more symbolic than scientific. One common method was known as vaginal fumigation, burning herbs or resins beneath the body in hopes of clearing blockages. Some physicians believed the womb could drift within the body, like a wandering creature, and that fragrant smoke might guide it back to its rightful place. The Roman physician Soranus, writing in the 2nd century CE, documented treatments we would now view with caution. Among them, warm wine-based infusions, heated oils applied to the lower abdomen, and even the use of animal-based remedies thought to carry vital warmth. The reasoning was more rooted in metaphor than in measurable results. There was no proof, only persistence. In a villa tucked in the countryside, a woman winces as a midwife presses against her hips, again and again. The room spins. The midwife mutters, "It must be stirred." The woman closes her eyes. She remains silent. Some believed that inactivity in the body could be corrected through forceful motion. Certain schools taught that the womb could become cold or unresponsive, and that only vigorous stimulation could restore its rhythm. It was a time when mystery surrounded the female form, and often, the answers sought came at a great cost. Of course, little of this was grounded in real understanding. The female body, in ancient Rome, remained a mystery, and when it failed to follow expectations, the answers turned harsh. You lift the lid of a clay jar unearthed in the ruins of Pompeii. Inside, a dark powder, fragments of ash, traces of vinegar, a hint of lead. It was believed to offer protection against pregnancy, but it likely caused more harm than help. Birth control in Rome was not rooted in science. It was guided by belief, by whispers passed from mother to daughter. There were no trained professionals, no proven methods, only rumor, desperation, and a long list of strange recipes. Some mixtures included honey, tree resin, or ashes combined with sour wine. Others relied on ingredients drawn from animals or the wild, crushed insects, powdered roots, even unusual minerals. Charms were worn too, rings tied with thread, pendants carved from bone or metal, talismans hung around the hips. Some methods were consumed, others were worn, but none were reliable. Still, for women seeking a measure of control, logic wasn't always the point. Hope was enough. Now you walk through the overgrown gardens of a forgotten estate. On a crumbling stone tablet, you spot a carving, delicate leaves in a circular cluster. Beneath it, one word, Silphium. There are no more plants like it today. Silphium once grew in the wilds of Cyrene, North Africa. It became famous in Rome for its supposed medicinal properties, especially for women. So prized was this plant that emperors stamped its image on silver coins. The resin of Silphium, it was said, could offer protection against unwanted pregnancy, and for a time, it gave women something rare, a quiet sense of agency, in a world where their choices were often taken before they could be made. But the plant was delicate, difficult to grow, and harvested without limits. By the 1st century CE, it had disappeared, extinct. Rome's hunger for control had exhausted the very thing that once gave women a small sense of freedom. The loss of Silphium was more than botanical. It was symbolic, a quiet warning of what happens when power is taken rather than shared. Inside a physician's room, a girl lies still. Warm oil is gently poured along her spine. She's told to breathe deeply, to remain calm, to have faith in the process. The midwife leans in and whispers, "If this doesn't help, there is another method." A pause. "It may be more difficult." The girl nods. She is 16. Roman physicians recorded practices we would now view as invasive. Treatments involved wool soaked in herbal mixtures, the use of sharp scents or bitter substances, and manual techniques aimed at correcting what was misunderstood. The line between medicine and ritual was often blurred. Many women instead sought out folk healers, wise women, midwives, herbalists, whose remedies were passed down in hushed voices across generations. Still, nothing was certain. When motherhood didn't come, the sorrow ran deep. It lingered quietly in the background, rarely spoken aloud, but written in the stillness of homes, and in the way some names slowly disappeared from memory. Now you walk the cracked stones of a Roman shrine to Juno Lucina, the goddess of childbirth. At your feet, tiny shoes, carved dolls, clay jars shaped like growing bellies. Scratched into the walls are dozens of prayers, nearly all the same. Make me a mother. In ancient Rome, fertility was more than a hope. It was an obligation. Women were praised not for who they were, but for what they could provide. And if they could not, whispers followed. Sometimes their place in the home shifted. Other times, they were quietly sent elsewhere. Even the law echoed this expectation. Emperor Augustus passed the Lex Papia Poppaea, a law that gave rewards to couples with 3 or more children, and penalties to those who remained childless. The state rarely considered the weight of motherhood, only the numbers it left behind. Picture her standing in a crowded marketplace. She buys herbs from a quiet vendor. Her hood is pulled low. Her hand trembles slightly as she counts the coins. This mixture might help, she's told, but it may be uncomfortable. She nods. It's not what she wants. It's simply the only option available. In ancient Rome, control over one's body was rare, especially for women. And so, they adapted. They shared knowledge in hushed tones, passed down remedies, charms, and cautions. They endured, treatments whispered about behind closed doors. They prayed softly to goddesses no one dared name aloud, because even in a world that told them they were lesser, they still held hope, still believed, still claimed the quiet right to choose when and if they would bring life into the world. Now, centuries later, you gaze through glass in a museum. A collection of bronze instruments lies under pale light. They gleam, polished, silent. But long ago, they were tools of care and uncertainty. They touched lives filled with questions, fear, and longing. They held the unseen stories of women whose names have long faded from record. Rome built aqueducts, amphitheaters, and empires. It wrote laws and carved legends in stone. But behind the grandeur, in the quiet corners of its cities, there was another struggle. Unspoken, unrecorded. A struggle faced by the very women who carried its future. Their bodies were not revered. They were regulated. And when they strayed from what was expected, they were not forgotten. They were silenced. You see her standing in a marble courtyard. Her dress is torn, her hair loose, her eyes fixed on the stone beneath her feet. Around her, whispers rise and ripple like smoke. Behind a curtain, a figure sharpens a blade, not in justice, but in judgment. In Rome, shame traveled quickly. And for women, silence was not safety. It was a sentence. In the world of ancient Rome, a woman's body was rarely her own. Her worth was linked to reputation, to lineage, to what others assumed about her. And when that image was challenged, whether through harm, accusation, or a simple misunderstanding, justice did not always arrive, but silence did, and often it came with consequences no words could undo. You now walk through the halls of a patrician estate. Gold glimmers from every corner. Mosaic floors shimmer beneath your feet. And behind one closed door, a sound, a soft cry, is quickly swallowed by silence. Footsteps follow, then stillness. In Roman law, personal harm was not always treated as an offense against the victim. It was often seen as an offense against another's household. A daughter was considered part of her father's domain, a wife under the authority of her husband, an enslaved woman, part of her master's property. If a woman suffered harm, it was not her pain that carried legal weight, but the perceived insult to the man responsible for her. If she was unmarried, her father could bring charges. If married, that power belonged to her husband. But she, herself, she held no legal voice of her own. And if no man stepped forward to speak on her behalf, then she disappeared, swallowed by silence. Now imagine a dimly lit courtroom under flickering torchlight. A young girl stands beside the one who wronged her. The magistrate speaks. Better a husband than a scandal. She nods. She is 14. In ancient Rome, it was not uncommon for the accused to offer marriage as resolution. The law saw this as a way to restore order, to preserve family honor. But for the girl, it often meant a lifetime tethered to the very person who had caused her pain. Her agreement was assumed, her healing left unattended. She was not viewed as someone in need of care. She was seen as someone whose reputation had been compromised. And in Rome, reputation required control, not compassion. Now you stand in the heart of a roaring amphitheater. Thousands cheer. The air is thick with noise, anticipation, and judgment. Below, a woman stands in the arena, her arms bound. She does not face trial. She faces entertainment. She was accused, perhaps of betrayal, of dishonor, or simply of disobedience. And now the sentence is the same once reserved for the gravest of crimes. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. A punishment once meant for traitors and murderers, now turned upon women accused of being unworthy. Dragged into the arena, they were given no defense. There was no trial. Only a sentence carried out before thousands. They stood, bound and exposed, while the crowd waited. Then the spectacle began. This was not about justice. It was about warning. Rome wanted its citizens to see what happened when a woman stepped beyond the boundaries of silence, of submission, of appearance. Now you walk through the narrow alleys of Subura. Smoke rises from cook fires. Children laugh somewhere behind the walls. Then, from one doorway, a figure is pulled into the street. She pleads. Her father follows close behind, holding something sharp. No one intervenes. No one meets her eyes. In ancient Rome, acts of familial punishment were not always hidden. They were protected by tradition. If a father believed his daughter had brought dishonor, whether by behavior, rumor, or even a glance, he held certain rights under Roman custom. This was called ius vitae necisk, the right over life and death, a legal privilege embedded in patriarchal authority. No trial was needed, no proof required, only belief. Sometimes the daughter had done nothing at all, but silence didn't protect her, because in Rome, perception was power, and the idea of her, what she might have done, or what others claimed to see, was more dangerous than truth. Now, inside the marble halls of the Palatine Palace, a young empress stares at her reflection. The mirror shows beauty, poise, control. But she knows the whispers in the court, knows how quickly admiration turns into suspicion. Every glance is measured, every word replayed. Even power cannot protect her. In fact, the higher a woman rose, the more fragile her position became. Consider Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius. Roman historians wrote of her ambition, her behavior, her wanderings into places deemed unfit for a woman of rank. Were the stories true? No one can say, because Rome didn't always need truth, only accusation. But the result was clear. She vanished from history without trial, because in Rome, a woman's image could be shaped into a weapon, used not to protect her, but to control her. She could become a symbol of disgrace, not through her actions, but through whispers, through suggestion, through stories carefully sculpted to serve power. And if the story didn't fit what Rome needed, she was removed from the page. You pass through the scattered stones of a rural shrine. Statues lie headless. A single piece of parchment remains. It lists names, and next to them, tax amounts. One name is marked with a red line. Beside it, the word dishonored, and a fine. In some corners of the Roman world, even those seen as victims were penalized. If someone was deemed to have lost honor, regardless of circumstance, they could be excluded from family inheritance, barred from public ritual, subjected to higher dowry taxes, not recognized as victims, but seen as risks. So many chose silence, chose not to speak, not to name what had happened, because to speak was to lose standing, to lose everything. Now you walk along the quiet banks of the Tiber River at dawn. Mist rolls between reeds. In the grass, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside, an old necklace, a worn sandal, a folded note. No signature, just one line. I could not carry the shame. There is no name, only stillness. Rome's laws were built to protect image, to preserve order and reputation. But in that pursuit, many were quietly removed, their stories left untold, their names unwritten, their pain unseen. To suffer in Rome was difficult, but to speak of suffering, that often brought worse. Some lost everything: status, home, family ties. Others simply disappeared from the record. You enter the Vatican archives. A historian opens a faded scroll from the 1st century CE. It's a legal document. The case? A girl accused of improper behavior. Her name is missing. The only detail preserved, removed from the family record. To be removed was the final silence, a life erased from lineage, from memory. Rome kept meticulous records, names in stone, ink, and wax. But for women who stepped outside control, who were seen too much, heard too clearly, the record became a wall, and behind it, they faded. You now stand at the edge of a ruined temple. Its pillars rise like broken ribs from the soil. Between them, quiet. The stone beneath your hand is worn smooth by time. It whispers no names, only absence. Rome is remembered for its laws, its art, its enduring empire. But beneath the marble and myth was another reality. A world where silence was structure, where forgetting was policy. For many women, survival meant disappearing. And for those who dared to speak, Rome knew how to silence them. So now, as the last echoes of ancient Rome fade into silence, you're left not with marble columns or military conquests, but with the ghosts of women history tried to forget. Not warriors, not senators, not poets carved into stone, but daughters, wives, midwives, performers, names lost, faces erased, stories buried under centuries of dust, shame, and law. Rome built an empire to last forever. It left behind aqueducts, amphitheaters, and scrolls filled with names of men who wrote the rules. But beneath all that splendor was a quiet war, fought not with swords, but with shame, not against armies, but against the bodies of women. Their voices were silenced, not by enemies, but by kin, by law, by ritual, by fear. And yet, they lived, they endured, they prayed in shadows, whispered to goddesses in hidden temples, passed down remedies in secret, and held their dignity in silence. Their resistance was not loud. It was quiet, unrecorded, real. You may not see them in history books, but they are there, in the cracks between marble, in the names scratched out, in the records with blank spaces where a woman once stood. So, if this story unsettled you, let it. If it moved you, carry it. Because to speak of them now is an act of resurrection. They were not myths. They were mothers. They were girls who smiled and danced and hoped and disappeared. Not because they failed Rome, but because Rome failed them. If this story opened your eyes, give it a like. Share it with someone who thinks they know what Rome really was. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from. Let's remind the world that silence is not the end, not when we choose to remember.